States which claimed a sovereign right to secede from the Union, naturally claimed the corresponding right to resume possession of all the land they had ceded to that Union's government for the use of its naval and military posts. So South Carolina, after leading the way to secession on December 20, 1860, at once began to work for the retrocession of the forts defending her famous cotton port of Charleston. These defenses, being of vital consequence to both sides, were soon to attract the strained attention of the whole country. There were 3 minor forts: Castle Pinckney, dozing away, in charge of a solitary sergeant, on an island less than a mile from the city; Fort Moultrie, feebly garrisoned and completely at the mercy of attackers on its landward side; and Fort Johnson over on James Island. Lastly, there was the world-renowned Fort Sumter, which then stood, unfinished and ungarrisoned, on a little islet beside the main ship channel, at the entrance to the harbor, and facing Fort Moultrie just a mile away. The proper war garrison of all the forts should have been over 1,000 men. The actual garrison, including officers, band, and the Castle Pinckney sergeant, was less than 100. It was, however, loyal to the Union, and its commandant, Major Robert Anderson, though born in the slave-owning state of Kentucky, was determined to fight. The day after Christmas, Anderson's little garrison at Fort Moultrie slipped over to Fort Sumter under cover of the dark, quietly removed workmen, who were mostly Baltimore secessionists, and began to prepare for defense. Next morning Charleston was furious and began to prepare for attack. The South Carolina authorities at once took formal possession of Pinckney and Moultrie, and 3 days later seized the United States arsenal in Charleston itself. 10 days later again, on January 9, 1861, the Star of the West, a merchant vessel coming in with reinforcements and supplies for Anderson, was fired on and forced to turn back. Anderson, who had expected a man-of-war, would not fire in her defense, partly because he still hoped there might yet be peace. While Charleston stood at gaze and Anderson at bay, the ferment of secession was working fast in Florida, where another tiny garrison was all the Union had to hold its own. This garrison, under 2 loyal young lieutenants, Slemmer and Gilman, occupied Barranca's barracks in Pensacola Bay. Late at night on the 8th of January, the day before the Star of the West was fired on at Charleston, some 20 secessionists came to seize the old Spanish Fort San Carlos, where, up to that time, the powder had been kept. This fort, though lying close beside the barracks, had always been unoccupied, so the secessionists looked forward to an easy capture. But, to their dismay, an unexpected guard challenged them, and, not getting the proper password in reply, dispersed them with the first shots of the Civil War. Commodore Armstrong sat idle at the Pensacola Navy Yard, distracted between the Union and secession. On the 9th, Slemmer received orders from Winfield Scott, General-in-Chief at Washington, to use all means in defense of Union property. Next morning, Slemmer and his 50 faithful men were landed on Santa Rosa Island, just 1 mile across the bay, where the dilapidated old Fort Pickens stood forlorn. 2 days later the Commodore surrendered the Navy Yard, the stars and stripes were lowered, and everything ashore fell into the enemy's hands. There was no flagstaff at Fort Pickens, but the Union colors were at once hung out over the northwest bastion, in full view of the shore, while the Supply and Wyandotte, the only naval vessels in the bay, and both commanded by loyal men, mast-headed extra colors and stood clear. 5 days afterwards they had to sail for New York, and Slemmer, whose total garrison had been raised to 80 by the addition of 30 sailors, was left to hold Fort Pickens if he could. Meanwhile, on the 18th of February, the greatest of all surrenders had taken place in Texas, where 19 Army posts were handed over to the state by General Twiggs. San Antonio was swarming with secessionist rangers. Unionist companies were marching up and down. The federal garrison was leaving the town on parole, with the band playing Union airs and Union colors flying. The whole place was at 6s and 7s, and anything might have happened. In April the main storm center went whirling back to Charleston, where Sherman's old friend Beauregard commanded the forces that encircled Sumter. Sumter, still unfinished, had been designed for a garrison of 650 combatant men. It now contained exactly 65. It was to have been provisioned for 6 months. The actual supplies could not be made to last beyond 2 weeks. Both sides knew that Anderson's gallant little garrison must be starved out by the 15th. But the excited Carolinians would not wait, because they feared that the arrival of reinforcements might balk them of their easy prey. On the 11th, Beauregard, acting under orders from the Confederate government, sent in a summons to surrender. Anderson refused. At 1:45 the next morning the summons was repeated, as pilots had meanwhile reported a Federal vessel approaching the harbor. Anderson again refused and again admitted that he would be starved out on the 15th. Thereupon Beauregard's aides declared immediate surrender the only possible alternative to a bombardment and signed a note at 3:20 a.m. giving Anderson formal warning that fire would be opened in an hour. Fort Sumter stood about half a mile inside the harbor mouth, fully exposed to the converging fire of 4 relatively powerful batteries, 3 about a mile away, the 4th nearly twice as far. At the northern side of the harbor mouth stood Fort Moultrie. At the southern stood the batteries on Cummings Point. And almost due west of Sumter stood Fort Johnson. Near Moultrie was a 4-gun floating battery with an iron shield. A mile northwest of Moultrie, farther up the harbor, stood the Mount Pleasant Battery, nearly 2 miles off from Sumter. At 4:30, in the first faint light of a gray morning, a sudden spurt of flame shot out from Fort Johnson, the dull roar of a mortar floated through the misty air, and the big shell, the first shot of the real war, soared up at a steep angle, its course distinctly marked by its burning fuse, and then plunged down on Sumter. It was a capital shot, right on the center of the target, and was followed by an admirable burst. Then all the converging batteries opened full, while the whole population of perfervid Charleston rushed out of doors to throng their beautiful East Battery, a flagstone marine parade 3 miles in from Sumter, of which and of the attacking batteries it had a perfect view. But Sumter remained as silent as the grave. Anderson decided not to return the fire till it was broad daylight. In the meantime all ranks went to breakfast, which consisted entirely of water and salt pork. Then the gun crews went to action stations and fired back steadily with solid shot. The ironclad battery was an exasperating target, for the shot bounced off it like dried peas. Moultrie seemed more vulnerable. But appearances were deceptive, for it was thoroughly quilted with bales of cotton, which the solid shot simply rammed into an impenetrable mass. At nightfall Sumter ceased fire while the Confederates kept on slowly till daylight. Next morning the officers' quarters were set on fire by red-hot shot. Immediately the Confederates redoubled their efforts. Inside Sumter the fire was creeping towards the magazine, the door of which was shut only just in time. Then the flagstaff was shot down. Anderson ran his colors up again, but the situation was rapidly becoming impossible. Most of the worn-out men were fighting the flames while a few were firing at long intervals to show they would not yet give in. This excited the generous admiration of the enemy, who cheered the gallantry of Sumter while sneering at the caution of the Union fleet outside. The fact was, however, that this so-called fleet was a mere assemblage of vessels quite unable to fight the Charleston batteries and without the slightest chance of saving Sumter. Having done his best for the honor of the flag, though not a man was killed within the walls, Anderson surrendered in the afternoon. Charleston went wild with joy, but applauded the generosity of Beauregard's chivalrous terms. Next day, Sunday the 14th, Anderson's little garrison saluted the Stars and Stripes with 50 guns, and then, with colors flying, marched down on board a transport to the strains of Yankee Doodle. The fall of Sumter not only fired all Union loyalty but made Confederates eager for the fray. The very next day Lincoln called for 75,000 3-month volunteers. 2 days later Confederate letters of marque were issued to any privateers that would prey on Union shipping. 2 days later again Lincoln declared a blockade of every port from South Carolina round to Texas. 8 days afterwards he extended it to North Carolina and Virginia. But in the meantime Lincoln had been himself marooned in Washington. On the 19th of April, the day he declared his first blockade, the 6th Massachusetts were attacked by a mob in Baltimore, through which the direct rails ran from north to south. Baltimore was full of secession, and the bloodshed roused its fury. Maryland was a border slave state out of which the District of Columbia was carved. Virginia had just seceded. So when the would-be Confederates of Maryland, led by the mayor of Baltimore, began tearing up rails, burning bridges, and cutting the wires, the Union government found itself enisled in a hostile sea. Its own forces abandoned the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and the Navy Yard at Norfolk. The work of demolition at Harper's Ferry had to be bungled off in haste, owing to shortness of time and lack of means. The demolition of Norfolk was better done, and the ships were sunk at anchor. But many valuable stores fell into enemy hands at both these Virginian outposts of the Federal forces. Through 6 long days of dire suspense, not a ship, not a train, came into Washington. At last, on the 25th, the 7th New York got through, having come south by boat with the 8th Massachusetts, landed at Annapolis, and commandeered a train to run over relayed rails. With them came the news that all the loyal North was up, that the 7th had marched through miles of cheering patriots in New York, and that these 2 fine regiments were only the vanguard of a host. On the 23rd of this eventful April, Lee was given the chief command of all Virginia's forces. 3 days later, Joe Johnston took command of the Virginians at Richmond. 1 day later, again Stonewall Jackson took command at Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry was a strategic point in northern Virginia. It was the gate to the Shenandoah Valley as well as the point where the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad crossed the Potomac some 60 miles northwest of Washington. Harper's Ferry was known by name to north and south through John Brown's raid 2 years before. It was now coveted by Virginia for its arsenal as well as for its command of road, rail, and water routes. The plan to raid it was arranged at Richmond on the 16th of April. But when the raiders reached it on the 18th, they found it abandoned and its arsenal in flames. The machine shops, however, were saved, as well as the metal parts of 20,000 stand of arms. In May, the Confederates cut the line near Grafton. As this broke direct communication between the West and Washington, McClellan sent forces from which 2 flying columns, 3,000 strong, converged on Philippi, 15 miles south of Grafton, and surprised 1,000 Confederates. These thereupon retired, with little loss, to Beverly, 30 miles farther south still. Here there was a combat at Rich Mountain on the 11th of July. The Confederates again retreated, losing General Garnett in a skirmish the following day. This ended McClellan's own campaign in West Virginia. By the end of May, Confederate pickets had been in sight of Washington, while McDowell, crossing the Potomac, was faced by his friend of old West Point and Mexican days, General Beauregard, fresh from the capture of Fort Sumter. By the beginning of July, General Patterson, a veteran of 1812 in Mexico, was in command up the Potomac near Harper's Ferry. He was opposed by Joe Johnston, who had taken over that Confederate command from Stonewall Jackson. On the 14th of June, Johnston had destroyed everything useful to the enemy at Harper's Ferry, and retired to Winchester. On the 20th, Jackson's brigade marched on Martinsburg to destroy the workshops of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. Meanwhile, McDowell's 36,000 had marched past the President, with bands playing and colors flying amid a scene of great enthusiasm. The press campaign was at its height, so was the speechifying, and 99 people out of every 100 thought Beauregard's 22,000 at Bull Run would be defeated in a way that would be sure to make the South give in. Sunday, July 21, 1861, was a beautiful midsummer day. Both armies were stirring soon after dawn. But a miscarriage of orders delayed the Confederate offensive so much that the initiative of attack passed to the Federals, who advanced against the Stone Bridge shortly after 6. This attack, however, though made by a whole division against a single small brigade, was immediately recognized as a mere feint when, 2 hours later, Evans, commanding the Confederate brigade, saw dense clouds of dust rising above the woods on his left front, where the road crossed Sudley Springs, nearly 2 miles beyond his own left. Forming the new front at right angles to the old, so as to attack and defend the Confederate left on the Matthews and Henry Hills, caused much confusion on both sides, but more on the Federal, as the Confederates knew the ground better. It was now past noon on that sweltering midsummer day, and there was a welcome lull for the rallying Confederates while the Federals were coming down the Matthews Hill, struggling across the swamps and thickets of Young's Branch, and climbing the Henry Hill. Within another hour the opposing forces were at close grips again, and the Federals, flushed with success and steadied by the regulars, seemed certain to succeed. But on its reverse slope lay Jackson's Shenandoahs, 3,000 strong, and by far the best drilled and disciplined brigade that either side had yet produced apart, of course, from regulars. Jackson had ridden up and down before them, calm as they had ever seen him on parade, quietly saying, "Steady, men, steady. All's well." In this way he had held them straining at the leash for hours. Now, at last, their time had come. 5 minutes later, as the triumphant Federals topped the crest, the long gray line rose up, stood fast, fired one crashing point-blank volley, and immediately charged home with the first of those wild, high rebel yells that rang throughout the war. The stricken and astounded Federal front caved in, turned round, and fled. There, in the valley, along Young's Branch, McDowell established his last line of battle, based on the firm rock of the regulars. But by this time the Confederates had brought up troops from the whole length of their line, the balance of numbers was at last in their favor, and nothing could stay the Federal recoil. Lack of drill and discipline soon changed this recoil into a disorderly retreat. Bull Run was only a special constable affair on a gigantic scale. The losses were comparatively small: 3,553 killed and wounded on both sides put together, not 10% of the less than 40,000 who actually fought. Moreover, the side that won the battle lost the war. And yet Bull Run had many points of very great importance. In spite of all shortcomings it showed the good quality of the troops engaged, if not as soldiers, at all events as men.